The story of Moses and the Exodus is one of the most pivotal events in the history of ancient Israel and in the foundations of Judeo-Christian belief. It takes place in a time when the Israelites were living as slaves in Egypt, a great and powerful empire ruled by a pharaoh who knew no mercy. For over 400 years, the Israelites had lived under the weight of oppression, their cries for freedom rising to the heavens. Egypt at the time was a land of incredible wealth and power, boasting monuments, armies, and a culture that seemed invincible. The pharaohs ruled with absolute authority, believed to be gods among men. The Hebrews, descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, had grown numerous but remained enslaved to the will of their Egyptian masters. They worked on massive monuments, temples, and storage cities. Day and night, they carried heavy loads, built towering structures, and dug deep into the earth, all to glorify the empire of Egypt. The labor was relentless, the taskmasters brutal, and their cries of suffering reached heaven. And then there was Moses. Born into this period of suffering, Moses was a Hebrew raised in the very courts of Pharaoh. Saved from death as an infant, he grew up with an identity torn between two worlds, the world of his oppressed people and the world of Egyptian royalty. But Moses' journey would not be defined by where he came from, but by a divine call that would change his life and the lives of his people forever. Moses was a man destined for greatness, but his life began with fear and uncertainty. The Pharaoh of Egypt had issued a decree that all newborn Hebrew boys were to be killed, fearing the growing number of Israelites in his kingdom. But Moses' mother, in an act of desperation and hope, placed her infant son in a basket and set him adrift in the Nile River. The child, carried by the river's current, was found by Pharaoh's daughter.
This must be one of the Hebrew children. Poor thing. I can't leave you here like this.
Moved by compassion, she decided to raise him as her own, within the very palace of the man who had ordered his death. And so, Moses was adopted into the royal family of Egypt, growing up as a prince in the courts of Pharaoh. In Pharaoh's palace, Moses was educated in all the wisdom and knowledge of the Egyptians. He learned to read and write in hieroglyphs, studied the art of warfare, and was trained in the ways of leadership and diplomacy. The lavish halls of the palace, filled with gold and treasures, became his home. He dined with nobles, walked the grand halls where Pharaoh himself reigned, and witnessed firsthand the power and splendor of Egypt's empire. But despite his privileged upbringing, Moses never forgot his true identity. Though he wore the robes of an Egyptian prince, he was a Hebrew by birth. He watched in silence as his people, his brothers and sisters, were subjected to brutal labor, forced to build the great monuments and cities of Egypt under the lash of the taskmasters. As he grew older, this inner conflict deepened. Though raised in luxury, his heart ached for the people he had been separated from, the people who labored under the cruelty of the Egyptian whips. And one day when the prince saw an Egyptian taskmaster beating a Hebrew slave, Moses' anger flared. In a fit of rage, Moses struck down the Egyptian and fled into the wilderness, leaving behind the comforts of Egypt to wander as an exile. Moses lived many years in the land of Midian, far from the grand palaces of Egypt and the cries of his people. He had found a simpler life as a shepherd. The quiet hills and valleys of the wilderness had become his home, the landscape barren but peaceful, offering solitude from the burdens of his past. But God had not forgotten Moses, and he was about to call him to a purpose far greater than Moses could have imagined. It was an ordinary day, much like any other. The sun hung high in the sky, casting long shadows over the rocky hills as Moses led his flock toward Mount Horeb, known as the Mountain of God. The sheep grazed quietly, and the wind whispered through the dry grass. Moses, thinking of little more than his duties, walked the familiar paths. But as he drew near the mountain, something caught his eye. A glow, faint at first, but growing brighter as he approached. A fire, burning among the bushes. Yet this was no ordinary fire. The flames danced and flickered, but the bush itself was not consumed. Moses stopped in his tracks, staring in wonder. As Moses approached, a voice called to him from the very heart of the fire. It was a voice unlike any he had heard before, a voice that carried both authority and tenderness.
Moses.
Moses, startled by the calling of his name, took a step back but responded. In that moment, the ground beneath Moses' feet seemed to change. The air grew thick with a holy presence, and the ordinary wilderness around him was transformed into sacred space. God spoke again, his voice echoing through the silence of the desert.
Do not come any closer. Take off your sandals, for the place where you are standing is holy ground.
With trembling hands, Moses removed his sandals, feeling the cool, rough earth beneath his feet. He had wandered these hills countless times, but never before had he felt the ground beneath him pulse with such divine power. He lowered his head, his heart racing. Who was speaking to him? Why had he, a simple shepherd, been called to witness such a sight? Then the voice spoke again, with the weight of eternity behind it.
I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob.
At these words, Moses' heart leapt and fear gripped him. This was no ordinary voice. It was the voice of the God of his ancestors, the God who had made promises to Abraham and led Isaac and Jacob. In awe, Moses covered his face, afraid to look directly at God. Then the Lord spoke words that would forever change Moses' life.
I have indeed seen the misery of my people in Egypt. I have heard their crying because of their slave drivers, and I am concerned about their suffering. So I have come down to rescue them from the hand of the Egyptians, and to bring them up out of that land into a good and spacious land, a land flowing with milk and honey.
The weight of these words pressed down on Moses, but there was more to come.
Now go. I'm sending you to Pharaoh to bring my people, the Israelites, out of Egypt.
Moses' heart pounded in his chest. For years he had lived in the wilderness, far from the power and terror of Egypt. Could he truly go back, to the land of his birth, to the courts of Pharaoh, and demand the freedom of the Israelites? Moses, though faithful, was overwhelmed by the enormity of the task before him.
Who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and bring the Israelites out of Egypt?
But God, ever patient, reassured him with a promise that would carry him through every trial to come.
Do not fear, I will be with you.
Reluctant but obedient, Moses returned to Egypt. The time had come for Moses to confront Pharaoh and demand the release of the Israelites. He said to him,
Thus says the Lord, the God of Israel, let my people go so that they may hold a feast to me in the wilderness.
Pharaoh, a man of immense pride and power, would not yield so easily.
Who is the Lord, that I should obey him and let Israel go? I do not know the Lord, and I will not let Israel go.
And so, the stage was set for one of the greatest displays of divine power in history. God sent a series of plagues upon Egypt, each more devastating than the last. Moses' older Hebrew brother Aaron, who often acted as a spokesman for Moses when conveying God's messages to Pharaoh, initiated the first plague. Aaron, standing by the Nile, raised his staff over the waters. The once mighty river, the lifeblood of Egypt, turned red as blood. Fish floated dead to the surface, and the stench of decay filled the air. The Egyptians, reliant on the Nile for sustenance, could find no drinkable water. Streams, rivers, ponds, and even the water stored in jars, all turned to blood. 7 days later, Moses once again approached Pharaoh, warning him of what would come if he continued to refuse God's command. But Pharaoh's heart did not soften, and the next plague descended upon Egypt. Suddenly frogs swarmed the land. From the rivers and ponds they came, covering the streets, entering homes, filling beds, and invading ovens. There was no escape from the incessant croaking and hopping creatures. Pharaoh, overwhelmed by the invasion, called for Moses.
Pray to the Lord to take the frogs away from me and my people. and I will let your people go to offer sacrifices to the Lord."
Moses prayed, and the frogs died, leaving piles of them across the land. But as the stench of decaying frogs filled the air, Pharaoh's heart once again grew hard, and he refused to let the Israelites go. Then came the gnats. Moses' brother Aaron struck the dust of the ground with his staff, and the dust turned into gnats, which swarmed throughout Egypt, biting people and animals alike. The very air seemed to buzz with the tiny creatures, tormenting all who lived in the land. But still, Pharaoh would not yield. Next came the flies. Great swarms filled the houses of the Egyptians and covered the ground so thickly that the land was ruined. Yet in the land of Goshen, where the Israelites lived, not a single fly could be found. God made a distinction between his people and the Egyptians. The sixth plague fell upon the livestock. Horses, donkeys, camels, cattle, sheep, all the livestock of the Egyptians died, but not one animal belonging to the Israelites was harmed. For the seventh plague, Moses and Aaron took handfuls of soot from a furnace and threw it into the air. Boils broke out on people and animals across Egypt, painful and burning. Then came the hail. Moses stretched out his staff toward the sky, and the Lord sent thunder and hail, with lightning flashing down to the ground. Never before had Egypt seen such a storm. The hail struck down everything in the fields, people, animals, and crops. Trees were shattered, and the land was devastated. But again, Goshen was spared. No hail fell where the Israelites lived. Pharaoh started pleading. Moses prayed, and the storm stopped. But Pharaoh's repentance was short-lived, and his heart grew hard once more. Then came the locusts. Driven by the wind, they swarmed over Egypt, covering the ground until it was black. They devoured everything that was left after the hail, the crops, the fruit, and the trees. Nothing green remained in all the land. And not long after came the darkness. For 3 days, a thick darkness covered Egypt, so heavy that no one could see or move. But again, in the land of Goshen, there was light for the Israelites. The final plague was the most gruesome. God had shown mercy, but now his judgment was about to fall.
At midnight, I will go throughout Egypt. Every firstborn son in Egypt will die, from the firstborn of Pharaoh to the firstborn of the slave girl, and even the firstborn of the cattle.
Moses warned Pharaoh of what was to come, but the king would not listen. God provided a way of protection for the Israelites. He instructed Moses to tell the people to sacrifice a lamb and mark their doorposts with its blood. The angel of death would pass over any house marked by the blood, sparing the firstborn within. That night, the cries of Egypt filled the air, as every Egyptian household mourned the loss of a firstborn. Pharaoh, broken by the loss of his own son, finally relented.
"Go! Leave my people, you and the Israelites. Go, worship the Lord as you have requested."
The Israelites left Egypt with haste, their hearts full of hope but also fear. For generations they had been slaves, and now, suddenly, they were free. With their families, livestock, and what little possessions they could carry, they journeyed toward the desert, guided by Moses, their chosen leader, and the God of their ancestors. The Lord himself went ahead of them, leading the way by a pillar of cloud during the day and a pillar of fire by night, a constant reminder of his presence and protection. But freedom would not come easily. Back in Egypt, as the dust settled and the wails of grief echoed through the land, Pharaoh's heart, once softened by the loss of his firstborn, began to harden again. The thought of losing so many slaves, so much wealth and labor, was unbearable. Pharaoh's anger burned, and in a moment of fury, he called for his army. His best chariots were prepared, 600 of them, and the entire Egyptian army was marshaled to pursue the Israelites. The ground trembled beneath the weight of their war chariots, and the sound of galloping horses filled the air as they raced across the desert sands, determined to bring the Israelites back or destroy them. The Israelites, unaware of the approaching danger, had reached the shores of the Red Sea. Before them stretched an endless expanse of water, and behind them lay the desert. It was here that the Lord instructed Moses to make camp, seemingly trapped between the sea and the wilderness. But God's plan was unfolding. As they rested by the waters, the sound of Pharaoh's army reached their ears. First a distant rumble, then louder and closer, like the roar of an approaching storm. Dust rose on the horizon, and panic spread through the camp. "Why did you bring us out of Egypt? Were there no graves there that we had to die here in the desert? It would have been better for us to serve the Egyptians than to die in this place." Their hearts, so recently filled with hope, were now overwhelmed with fear. The vast sea before them seemed an impossible barrier, and behind them, the relentless Egyptian army drew closer with every passing moment. Chariots gleamed in the sunlight, and the war cries of Pharaoh's soldiers pierced the air. But Moses, standing tall at the water's edge, did not waver. He knew that God had not led them this far only to abandon them now.
Do not be afraid. Stand firm, and you will see the deliverance the Lord will bring you today. The Egyptians you see today you will never see again. The Lord will fight for you. You need only to be still.
The people stood trembling, their eyes fixed on Moses. Then, as the sun began to set, the pillar of cloud that had led the Israelites shifted, moving behind them, standing between them and the Egyptian army. It cast a deep darkness over the Egyptians, but on the side of the Israelites, the night was filled with light from the pillar of fire. The Egyptians could not advance, but still, there was the sea. Moses, listening to the voice of God, raised his staff high over the waters. The wind began to blow, a strong east wind, like none the people had ever felt. It swept across the waters, driving them back, and before their astonished eyes, the sea began to part. The waters divided, forming towering walls on both sides, and in the middle, a path of dry ground stretched across the seabed. With hearts pounding and breath held in disbelief, the Israelites began their journey across the sea. Families, children, and elders walked on dry ground, passing between the walls of water that loomed on either side. The wind howled, and yet they were unharmed, untouched by the waters. They walked in faith, knowing that the God who had brought them out of Egypt was now making the impossible possible. But behind them, Pharaoh's army did not hesitate. When the pillar of cloud lifted and the darkness faded, Pharaoh, filled with wrath and pride, commanded his chariots to charge after the Israelites, straight into the path God had opened in the sea. The Egyptians pursued them, their chariots rumbling across the dry ground of the seabed, their horses galloping, spears raised high. They were confident, certain that they would capture the fleeing Israelites. As the last of the Israelites reached the other side, Moses, standing at the water's edge, looked back. The entire Egyptian army was now in the middle of the sea, chasing after his people. The Lord spoke once more, and Moses stretched out his hand over the waters. Suddenly, the wind that had held back the sea began to shift, and the walls of water trembled. The dry path, once so firm beneath the feet of the Israelites, began to soften, and the chariot wheels of the Egyptians sank into the mud. The Egyptian soldiers tried to turn back, but it was too late. As the last of the Israelites stepped onto dry land, the waters began to rush back. The walls of the sea collapsed with a mighty roar, and the waves crashed down upon Pharaoh's army. Chariots, horses, and soldiers were swept away, swallowed by the sea. Not a single Egyptian survived. The Israelites, standing on the far shore, watched in awe as the waters returned to their place, covering the chariots and washing away the enemy that had once enslaved them. In that moment, they knew that their God had delivered them, not by their own strength, but by his mighty hand. And so the Israelites were free, not only from the land of Egypt, but from the power of Pharaoh himself. They stood on the shore of the Red Sea, no longer slaves but a people set apart, chosen by God. They did not know what the wilderness would bring, nor how long their journey to the Promised Land would take, But in that moment, they knew one thing: God had delivered them. The story of the parting of the Red Sea stands as one of the most powerful miracles in all of Scripture, a testament to God's sovereignty, His protection, and His ability to make a way where there seems to be no way. For generations, it has been a source of hope and faith for those who trust in the Lord, a reminder that even in the darkest moments, God is able to part the seas in our lives and lead us to freedom. The story of Moses and the Exodus is not just a tale of freedom from physical bondage. It is a story of faith, of trust in the power and providence of God, even in the face of overwhelming odds. It is a reminder that God hears the cries of the oppressed and acts on their behalf. For the religious community today, the Exodus represents deliverance and hope. It is the foundation of the Jewish festival of Passover, a time to remember God's mighty hand in delivering the Israelites from slavery. For Christians, the Exodus also carries a deeper symbolism, a foreshadowing of the ultimate deliverance through Jesus Christ, who brings freedom from the bondage of sin. This story, passed down through generations, continues to inspire faith, perseverance, and the belief that with God, no obstacle is insurmountable.